Agile podcast. I'm your host Shahin, and today I have a very renowned guest, Diana Larsen. I had the pleasure of learning from her through her books and meeting her in one of the Agile Alliance conferences. She's an author, she's a speaker, she's a keynote speaker. I won't do the justice describing her and telling you guys about her. So I'm going to let her do the introduction. Hi, Diana. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Hi, Shahin. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell us, who is Diana?
Okay. Well, in this context, in the Lean on Agile context, I am a person who's been in the Agile community for a very long time. I first knew about Agile methods and started thinking and talking about them in about 1999, 2000, and have been part of the community ever since. I've written a few books, Agile retrospectives and liftoff, and more recently, I have been involved with the Agile Fluency project because of an article that I wrote with James Shore called the Agile Fluency Model. And we are now, after many years of me being a coach, an Agile coach and consultant, and a mentor to many folks, we now have a service where we do training for Agile coaches. So I bring all the things that I learned as an Agile coach and the ways to be effective as an Agile coach to help other folks enlarge their practices and just kind of level up their ability to help other folks. Yeah.
Okay. So in one or two words, if you want to call yourself anything, give yourself a title, would be the Agile Fluent person?
Well, Agile Fluency is one of the things, mostly through my whole career in the Agile community. The thing I have been focused on is team learning, how teams learn and improve. And so that's retrospectives, that's liftoffs and Agile chartering, that's the Agile Fluency model. That thread goes through all those things. So I'm a lifelong learner. And I encourage other folks in their group and individual learning as well.
I want to take this conversation in two different directions. You talked about teamwork, and I want to ask you about teams and tell us what a team is. And then you said that you're a lifelong learner. I want to ask you what you're learning right now. So it's up to you which one to answer first.
Well, what I'm learning right now, because of the current state of the world, is I am diving deeply into how to set the best conditions for people to learn through remote and online channels. And so looking for all of the tips and techniques I can discover that are, create a good environment for people to learn when they can't be face-to-face and engaged interpersonally with each other directly. Everything's got to be mediated by Zoom or other kinds of video conferencing tools and other kinds of online tools that people are using, like Miro and Mural and various ones. And so I'm learning as much as I can about how to make that a rich learning environment. So that's where my learning edge is right now. And also how to help my business survive in this climate. That's the other piece of learning I'm doing right now. But in terms of teams, I have always had an affinity for humans in groups. People used to, I occasionally will act as a mentor for someone, but I'm not really well suited to be an individual coach, but I'm very well suited to coach organizations and teams, because I resonate with that systemic idea of people in groups together, and how a really well functioning group, team, or an organization is greater than the sum of its parts. It brings that idea of synergy that was been bounced around for a while. But the interactions between and among people create a richness that just would not be there otherwise. And so I'm fascinated by that, and fascinated by how groups learn as opposed
Mm.
to individual learning, which is also interesting. I'm very interested in my own learning, but
Mm.
I'm fascinated by how groups learn and develop co-intelligence, and how they can most effectively, how the members of a group can most effectively rely on each other to reach their common goals.
I would assume that working with groups or teams and coaching them is much more complex than individuals. Is that a correct assumption?
I don't know if it's a correct assumption. It's different. I think people who are very experienced leadership coaches, executive coaches, therapeutic social workers, or counselors. I mean, I think the human psyche is
Mm-hmm.
is a very deep and complex thing, and so I would not say necessarily that groups are more complex than that, but they are complex in a different way,
Right.
because the interactions between the parts, for one thing, are clearer, and if you know how to look. I mean, for an individual, the interactions that are going on inside a person are very hard to discern,
Mm-hmm.
particularly their emotions and things. But in a group, you can begin to see patterns of interactions and patterns of exchanges between and among the members of the group, and then also the other parts of the system, which include their surroundings and their environment,
Right.
and everything else. So it's just a different approach.
True. And I would assume that based on these recent events, and now we are working remotely, um, working with groups is gonna make harder to work with them because everyone is in there sitting, seeing them. It's not
Right.
in a group setting, if I may say.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that it is objectively harder,
Okay.
but I will say I think we have been more habituated
Mm-hmm.
to working with people that we can be with physically in the same space. And those, for most of us, those are the habits and the techniques and the routines that we have developed. And now we are faced, those of us who do want to work with teams and organizations and groups, we are faced with learning what are the things that are effective in those situations, as opposed to taking the things that we have been doing in person and then just trying to cram them into the online remote
Right.
space and try to make them work in the same way, which they really won't. It's a new situation, and
Mm-hmm.
it's going to take new approaches and new ways of thinking about it. I mean, I always like to say, for people who are like natural food people, there's this thing about, well, you could have chocolate with its chocolate and its sugar and its fats and everything that's in it, or you could have this carob thing. And if you try to take carob and substitute it for chocolate, it's never going to be the same. But if you appreciate carob for being carob and just deal with it for its properties and tastes and purposes, then it can be a perfectly enjoyable thing, right? So it's matching fit for purpose is basically what we're looking
Right.
for. I don't expect carob to be
Right.
chocolate.
Right.
I,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
don't expect the tools that I use
Right.
in person with teams to necessarily be the same tools that are going to
Right.
work
Right.
when I'm working with teams online.
So this is very interesting for me to know. Was there any a turning point in your career that you figure out that you want to work with groups and focus on group dynamics versus one-on-one? Like, how did you got to this point that you focus on organization and teams?
Yeah, well, I think that I don't think there was a turning point. I think it's always been a part of me. I've
Mm-hmm.
always liked being working collaboratively, as more than working on my own. I like using visual tools to engage with folks. So I like, I'm sure there are personality style reasons and things for this, but I didn't recognize that that's where my main talents lie until I was probably in my 40s, and I really understood the difference that, that there were folks who saw the world differently than me
Right.
and who had an affinity for, much more of an affinity for working individually, whereas I like being in a training situation, I like being in a coaching situation, I like facilitating open space events. I and it's because I like seeing the patterns. It's like
Right.
watching people in a ballroom dancing together.
Right. Right.
Um, I also appreciate a single person dancing, but
Right.
my heart goes to seeing a
Yes.
group of people
Right.
moving
Right.
together in the space.
Right.
So,
Do you have any failure stories or horror stories about something that might have gone very wrong in a group setting that you were part of, or you were coaching, or you were consulting?
um, not really. I mean, there are. I think it's all in how you look at things. There certainly have been situations where I was hoping that one kind of thing would happen, and it turned out that something very different happened. But
Right.
I've been doing open space events long enough that I have actually pretty much integrated the idea that whatever happens is the only thing that could. That when we are in
Mm-hmm.
complex systems, there is going to be emergent properties. Things are going to come up that we don't expect and may not be prepared for. And all that we can do is be prepared to be resilient and flexible in those situations. So I am actually trying to think of an instance where it's usually I flex with the group.
Mm-hmm.
If things aren't going the way I thought they were going to go, then I ask the group, well, what way do you want to go?
Right.
And then I bring my skills to helping them do what they need to do. So I think the horror stories and the oftentimes can come from wanting things to be a different way than how
Mm-hmm.
they are.
Right.
And for me, that's never been very effective.
Right.
If I try to stick with wanting things to be
Right.
different than they are.
Right.
So I try to stay in touch with kind of the reality of the situation.
Right. So.
So here's an example. I was working with a group of folks, a large department of folks, and they had been dealing with a lot of small conflicts that became big conflicts between and among the different teams. It was an IT department. And so we decided that we would all get together and we would have just do some training and do a session about what are some techniques that we can use when we're faced with these conflicts. How can we move through them? And so the day came when we were going to have this event, and the different teams showed up and they sat in table groups according to their teams, which is what I wanted them to do. And I started to bring out the material that I had prepared for them to, do some different things and do some practice sessions, some role playing, different things to look at the nature of the conflicts that came up for them and so on. And I could just tell that everything I was talking about was hitting a wall.
Mm-hmm.
It was like nobody was engaged. Nobody was, you know, wanted to do any of the things that I was bringing to them. And so I just stopped and I said, tell me what's going on. And it turned out that a couple of days before, when I had worked with their boss and we had put the final touches on this, in the meantime, and over the course of the next day, there had been an announcement made that the entire department was going to be outsourced, and some people were going to still have their jobs, but they would have to work for this outsourcing company, and other
Mm-hmm.
people were just going to be laid off. And here they all were in this room in a conflict training,
Right,
right, that
right.
nobody wanted to be in at that point,
Right,
right? So I just said, well, this is, it's stupid to continue to do this. Let's
right,
talk about what's happening for you, and
right,
let's figure out how you can bring what you know and how you know how to be to bear, so that you can move through this surprising and unexpected situation, an announcement, in the best possible way. And so we spent about an hour and a half kind of talking through their issues with that.
right,
And then somebody said, well, no matter where we go, we're going to need conflict tools. So tell us what you were going to do with this. And so then we just smoothly went back into
right,
I decided which activities were going to be
right.
worthwhile doing that day and which ones weren't. And so we finished out the day, and they were happy and went on their merry way. But it was a day that went very different than I expected it
Right,
to. But I
right,
wouldn't say it was a horror story. It was a very
right.
successful day in the
Yeah,
end,
yeah.
but it
So if
required everyone to be flexible and resilient. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So if I can say, I think your superpower, the way that you described it, is facilitation. You felt the room, you talked, you saw the process was not working, and then you talked about it instead of
Right.
ignoring that. So,
Right.
yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
True facilitator. Um,
Thank you.
so you mentioned that you are in agile space for the longest time, like
Yes.
1999. What excites you about agile? What keeps you excited about agile these days?
Yeah. Well, before I met the people I met that influenced me to kind of move this direction, the work I was doing at that point in the late 80s and through the 90s was work process redesign. So I would go into mostly technical organizations, and that had some kind of a work process flow that wasn't working very well for them, that somebody decided, their boss or somebody. And they would ask me and some colleagues to come in and help them redesign their work process so that they would get more of the outcomes that they wanted. And inevitably, because I was working in technical organizations, high tech manufacturing, engineering organizations, IT organizations, all of the work that people were doing was very much knowledge work. I mean, I wasn't working with people who were digging ditches, really. I mean, even the manufacturing people I was working with were doing highly skilled electronic parts and equipment that needed them to be they weren't just a pair of hands. They needed to
Mhm,
be thinking all the time about what they were doing. And so what we would do is come in and work with people to help them understand their current workflow. We did things like what we call now value stream analysis and those kinds of things with folks. And then we gave them some principles around, you want a high quality of work life, and you want to be close to your customer, and you want to deliver a high quality product, and so some of those principles that they all agreed to. And then we worked with them so that they redesigned their work
mhm,
so that it made more sense to them and that it could be more of a flow every single time. And we did not go in with this end in mind, but every single time folks decided that what the way they needed to work was in cross-functional self-organizing teams.
nice.
And so I had 10 years of experience doing that, more than 10 years experience doing that. And then I happened to be at an event where there were some folks from the extreme programming community and a couple of the other communities that came into the agile space. And we started talking, and I started asking them some questions about, well, so when they were doing teams, how were they doing them? And they were telling me about it. And we just discovered a real affinity for each other.
Right.
There was a time in my life when I thought I was going to be a systems analyst. So
Mm-hmm.
I thought I was going to be more in the software world, and but then things happened and I went a different direction. But so I felt a strong affinity to what these what the folks were doing, and eventually we all went up to Snowbird and they decided to call it Agile.
Right.
But by that time I was already hooked,
Right.
because I could see that the skills that I had developed over those previous 10 years could be helpful in
Mm-hmm.
this space, and that it would be interesting work for me. So it was just a good match.
What is beyond Agile? Like, what do you think? Is there anything beyond that?
I don't know if it has a name yet.
Okay.
I like a lot of what folks are doing. I mean, I like Joshua Karyevsky's Modern Agile.
Mm-hmm.
I like what Yuta Eckstein and John Buck are doing with the Bossa Nova, the Beyond Budgeting, Open Space, Sociocracy, and Agile mashup. I like some of the stuff that Alistair Coburn is talking about in the heart of Agile. I mean,
Right.
there's a lot of interesting people looking at the Agile space right now and looking at what needs to come next in the Agile space right now. And no one has really coalesced on one name, but I think what's interesting about it is that after 20 years of methodologies being in conflict with each other,
Right.
is XP better, is Scrum better, is Safe better, or is less better, that there's been all this kind of competitive methodology space,
Right.
that now we are moving into a time where Agile Fluency, the Agile Fluency model and the way we think about things, and Bossa Nova and Modern Agile, and all of those things are highly complementary.
Mm-hmm.
There is nothing about them that says if you're doing Modern Agile, you could not also use a lens of Agile Fluency for that, or vice
Right.
versa.
Right.
And so that is a direction that I see Agile going. And of course, another direction that Agile is going is the whole idea of agility and business
Mm-hmm.
agility, and sort of spreading some of the ideas of Agile outside of software, which I think is interesting because, from my point of view, of course, a lot of the things that we think of as Agile were already happening in the 90s outside of software, because I was there doing some of them,
Right. Right.
and doing self-organizing cross-functional teams, and
Right.
working in small bites, and staying close to the customer.
Right.
And those aren't new ideas. Those are ideas that have been around for quite a long time. But I think the term Agile was brilliant because it is enabling this idea of the shift into agility, and for use in the broader business in a way that wasn't happening necessarily before. So
Right.
I don't know for sure where it's headed. I think we are on, particularly with the way millennials seem to be participating in the workplace. I think we are headed for a, a, a more humane workplaces.
Mm-hmm.
The Agile Alliance a few years ago said in their purpose statement, productive, humane, and sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is an effort to sort of optimize those three qualities of, we're going to make sure that we have the things we need because we're going to produce those, but we're going to do that in a way that is that recognizes the humans involved, and that is sustainable both for the business and the environment that
Right.
the business is in. So I think the arc of history is moving more in that direction, but of course
Right.
it's kind of a bumpy ride getting
Yeah,
there.
it's a very bumpy ride right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and right now
Yeah.
it's particularly bumpy.
Right.
And so that's what's fascinating though about
Right.
this, everyone working from home and social distancing, and because
Mhm.
people have a need for touch.
Right.
People have a need to breathe each other's air. And how that's I'm really curious about how that is going to continue to manifest itself, and if it will look very different.
Mhm.
There is no going back. There is no,
Right.
we're not ever returning to any sort of previous normal.
Yeah.
um, but what we are going to do is create some new world, and I'm really curious to see what that is going to look like and what its attributes will be.
So for our newer audiences or audiences newer to Agile,
Mhm.
what are your recommendations for them in this board?
There have been, I think one of the interesting things is that new things have been, not just new methodologies, but other kinds of new practices have been coming on board. I think the movement toward, the movement from single programmer to programmer to pair programming to self-organizing teams, and now into actual mob programming. I think that's a really interesting journey that those ideas are taking, and that the ever increasing collaboration that shows is really interesting. I think and so I would have people pay attention to that. If there are lots and lots of places where there are mob programming events where you can just go and sit in and see, because anybody can participate in that, and I think it's kind of fun and entertaining in a way, if you like writing code. So that's a thing. I mean, I would look for opportunities to participate in these things. Look for opportunities to participate in open space conferences. I think
Mhm.
open space conferences are, for one thing, they tend to be pretty accessible. They're usually, if they're in person, they're regional. Now
Right.
I'm seeing some opportunities for online open space conferences popping up, and being involved in those are a great place to be introduced to both old and new ideas.
Right.
So you can get a good overview of Agile in those kinds of events.
Yeah.
um, my love is this whole idea of continuous learning and continuous improvement,
Mhm.
and continuous learning that leads to continuous improvement. Those things are connected. And so learning as much as you can about retrospectives and some of the Toyota kata methods and all of these ways that help groups of people with their reflection and learning, and then using that learning to make things better for themselves, make their product better, make their relationships, their working relationships better. Those are all things I think that are really worth looking at, and getting comfortable with there not being checklists and check boxes.
Mhm.
I think we are moving out of the world
Right.
where certain kinds, I mean, I think there are places where checklists are hugely valuable. The whole idea of the checklist manifesto that Atul Gawande wrote about making sure that people are washing their hands, and that there are certain things that you really do need to do. Pilots in a cockpit, there are certain things you really need to do, but you want that to be in service of you, not in service of the checklist, right? I mean, there's something there. And a big mistake I see people make a lot is when they choose online tools,
Mhm.
or particularly managing their backlogs, or doing those kinds of things, they end up letting the tool use them instead of figuring out how they can use the tool to best serve their purpose. So I'm very much I'm wary of those things, and I hope people will be more careful and not just accept kind of in whole cloth,
mm,
oh, well, we have this tool, so we must do these things
right,
because this tool does all these
right.
things.
I like how
Um,
you use the term the tool use them because I see
yeah,
that very much. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Because this tool is designed this way, then we are going to
yeah,
shape our work that way, and we are going to do that because we don't
right,
have anything else in that tool. Yeah, yeah.
right, right.
Mm,
Yeah. So those are all things I think I would be, if I were new, or if I were talking to new people, I would want them to be wary of. And,
right,
there's a rich opportunity for new experiences here, but there are also things to be careful about. And,
right. Okay, so let's talk about your um most recent adventure, if I may say, the Agile Fluency. You talked
yeah.
about it a little bit. Um, so tell us more about the Agile Fluency. You said you started with James Shore on this one. I believe Martin Fowler wrote an article on that, if I'm not mistaken.
Martin Fowler very graciously published the article that James and I
Oh,
wrote
okay, right,
on his site, and we were thrilled when he made the offer to do that. We
right,
had worked on it for 3 or 4 years at that point, refining it, sharing it, getting reviews, so on. And then when we said, we think it's ready, but do you think it's ready? And we sent it out to some of the folks that we respected the most. Martin was one of them. And one of the questions we asked was, if this article is ready, where should we publish it?
right,
And when he got back to us, he said, I think it's ready and I would like to publish it. And so we were ecstatic at that
right, right,
point.
right,
And so he published it for us in August of 2012. And we thought that was that. We had these ideas, we wrote them down, and they got published, and we were ready to go on to other things. I was in the middle of um, writing the second edition of our liftoff book. James was doing some other things, and we just kind of walked away from it. And then we started hearing people contacted us, or in various ways we started hearing about folks who were using the model, who had
right,
figured out for themselves how to apply it. And then we were contacted by other folks, or in my case, I was working at a client and I told them about the model. It came up in conversation, and our client there, who was a VP of the technology area in a pretty large organization, he said, well, how do I know where my teams are, and what else can we learn about this? Because he got very intrigued by it. How can I decide what zone my teams need to be in, and so on. And so he stimulated us to think about what other tools did people need in order to, or what other supports did people need in order to be able to actually make use of the model, to implement it. And so that led us to develop some additional materials. And then by early 2015, we decided, gosh, we're spending so much time on this. This isn't just some little side effort at this
right,
point. This is taking over more of our lives than we had expected.
right,
And so at that point, we kind of formally made the Agile Fluency project as an organization, as a business, and and began looking at how could we disseminate the things that we had created in our ideas more. And eventually it came that the best that James and I don't scale very well. I mean, we can only deal with a few clients in any
right,
given year, and more and more people were asking us about this. And so we said, well, we can't be the only ones who are carrying this information. We need to share this as broadly as we possibly can. And
right.
so that's when we began putting together workshops and training programs and supports for the people who'd been through our workshops, and those kinds of things to help very experienced coaches who seem to get it the best, help them add the Agile Fluency suite now of materials to their toolbox so that they can bring that out when it seems appropriate for their clients.
Right.
So that's what we're doing now,
Right.
and it's really gratifying because it allows me to take the things that I've learned over really 30 to 40 years of coaching and consulting in this space and related spaces, to be able to share that with folks and, you know, help give other people a leg up
Right.
in some of the techniques and things that I've learned, that particularly things about how do you enter an organization, how do you talk to people to create the partnership with your
Mm-hmm.
client and help them reach the goals that they have set for themselves, and help them realistically assess which of those things are possible and which aren't, and where can they get the outcome, that where can they afford to get the outcomes they want, and where does it take trade-offs that are just not possible for them,
Right.
and have a more realistic assessment of
Right.
what they can accomplish.
Right. So if you want to describe this agile fluency model, what would this be? I know that it's not a maturity model, so
No.
yeah.
No, well, when we use the term fluency very deliberately,
Mm-hmm.
and we use it in a similar way to people talk about to what the people who really study languages will talk about fluency with languages. Lay people, normal people, you run into somebody, they say, oh, they've been to Iran, and someone will say, well, how did you get along there? Were you able to, how fluent in the language were you, right? But nobody really knows what that means, right? Because they're really, when you think about language fluency, it's, were you fluent enough to be an effective tourist? Were you able to get from their hotel to the bus station, or what, those kinds of things that you wanted to do? Or were you able to go to a coffee shop and talk to anybody who came along and just have streaming conversations? Or were you able to teach at the university? I mean, those are
Right.
very different fluencies
True.
according to the need you have for that language. And what the insight that Jim and I had was, depending on the nature of the product and the nature of the business, the agile fluency that companies or IT departments need from their teams is different depending on what they're trying to accomplish,
Right.
in a very similar way. And so we did some research and study and talked to a lot of people, and discovered that we could identify sort of roughly 4 what we call zones of fluency.
Mm-hmm.
And each one of them, each of the zones can stand on its own if it's the zone that you need. Right? So the thing about the Agile Fluency model is, it's not about maturity, because we're not saying everybody needs to grow up in the same kind of way. What it's more, I mean, we call it a path. It's more like lately we've been using the analogy of a bus zone. You go to if you're on a bus, you go to the zone that the bus serves, that has the stuff you want. If you want to
Right.
go downtown and get a building permit, you don't ride the bus all the way out to the suburbs to the big box stores. I
Right.
mean, you only go out there if you want to
Right.
go in and buy something out of the big box stores. So it is then the role of the coach and consultant in using the model is to talk it through and explore it with their prospective client or their current client, to determine what zone is going to be right for each of their teams.
Right.
And then when they have a sense of where it is, what zone would be the right zone, would give them the right kind of benefits for their product and their customers and their needs, then you can decide, well, what agile methods might be helpful there? What kind of agile proficiencies? What groups of skills would the teams need to be able to bring to bear in order to give that outcome?
Right.
And so it's the fluency, was what is the habitual routine way of working that this organization needs from these teams to be able to get the outcomes that they want.
Right.
And so that's what we work with coaches to do, to help them have those conversations. And then we did eventually developed a diagnostic so that people can tell, well, so where my teams are now, because if you know where the teams are now, then you know what kinds of investments you can make that will help all the teams get to the place where you need them to be. And not make just investments willy-nilly or follow some sort of prescribed uh, practice training for some
Right.
methodology. Make sure it's the one that is really going to work for you. And maybe your teams have come already equipped with two-thirds of the things to be effective in the zone you need them to be fluent in, and they only need help with the other third of things.
Right.
And so the diagnostic helps you figure that out.
Right.
And then the coach works with those leaders and develops an investment plan to
Mm-hmm.
fill in that gap
Right.
and help the teams get to the place that where they can be achieving what the organization wants them to achieve. Because that's what's satisfying for everybody, right, is feeling successful at making sure that we're performing and producing in the way that and meeting expectations
Right.
and finding the best way to do that.
Right. Um, I had the pleasure of learning more about Agile Fluency when James Shore was in Toronto in
Right,
person.
yeah, he was
Yeah,
there a few years ago.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But for the folks that are new to Agile Fluency, is there any tools available that they can practice? You mentioned about the diagnostic tool. Is this
Right.
available online that they can use? Some resources maybe that you can share with them?
Well, what is online, if you go to our website, agilefluency.org, you can follow the links. It starts on the homepage. And we have a free ebook download, which it's the same as the article on Martin Fowler's website, but it's arranged in a way that's a little bit easier to read on mobile devices and things like that. And also it's easier to share because it's a downloadable PDF. You can share it with other folks, and it's free, so you can dive into that we have several different pages on our website that have different kinds of information. We have a blog, and we have a page that talks about the suite of materials, which at this point is the model, the diagnostic, and something we call our improvement cycle, and then what the possibilities are there. And then in order to gain access to some of the more more nuanced tools like the diagnostic and so on, that's when we provide workshops. And
Mm-hmm.
so people can come and take our workshops to learn to use those tools, and then they have a license to
Right.
use those tools for a year. And
Right.
then people renew their licenses, and we have a very high renewal rate for our
Right.
licenses
Right.
because
And
people find it useful and
right.
they like being a part of the community that we've
Right.
created.
And it comes with a game as well, Agile Fluency game too.
Well, there is the Agile Fluency game is available as well. It's right now it's a little bit on hold because it is an in-person game.
Yeah,
There's
true.
no other way to play the game but in
Yeah,
person. If you've played it, you
yeah,
you know you need it's very tangible, and you need to be able to sit and talk with your teammates as you're playing the game. But we have a page on our website about it, and it is a very powerful tool. I am hoping that we can get to the place where we aren't so constrained by social distancing that we can
mm,
use those kinds of tools again.
mm,
Um, because it has, I know it's helped a lot of people. I just put a blog post on our website today that is a guest post from Allison Pollard, who's talking about how she has used the Agile Fluency game to help her clients in their Agile adoptions.
Right.
So yes, it is another tool, and that's another thing that's available.
Right.
But again, you have to go through a workshop
Yeah.
to get a license to
Yeah.
facilitate that game, because it's a very complex game, and the facilitation of it is you have to, there are some things you really have to learn in order to be able to help people play the game.
Right.
The rules are a little challenging, like a lot of Euro games, the kind of role playing, we're all in it together, we got to get from here to there kind of
Yeah.
games. They all have a lot of rules and a lot of tracking that you
Right.
have to do and things like that. And that's part of the fun.
Right.
And I think it's a very fun game. I
Right.
like to play it,
Yeah.
even now, but because I like to try different paths. So, well,
Right.
what if I played it this way? What if I played it that way? What if,
Yeah. So I enjoy a lot facilitating educational things with
Mhm.
games, and we run a 1 day open space in Toronto
Right,
called Agile Games Canada around games.
right. Hmm.
So I just want to ask you about the game. How much does it take to design this game? Like, tell us.
Oh my gosh. It is it I'm trying to remember. I think it was 2010 when Arlo Belshi and James Shore first started developing it. And then, or maybe it was, no, maybe it was a couple of years after that. But they started it right around the same time that Jim and I were writing our article and doing our research. And it has been through years and years and years of play testing. And then finally, after we started the Agile Fluency project, we turned it into an actual boxed set kind of
Right.
game. And so we've had it available, I think, since 2016 or 2017,
Mm.
where you could buy it as a box. But it took years and years of development,
Mm.
and it's still, I mean, there are still things,
Right.
recommendations that we get that Jim has recorded somewhere on a little thing.
Right.
But they are the ones who developed that game.
Right.
I'm a good facilitator of the
Right.
game.
Right. Right. As
And
your
I can teach
superpower is.
people. Yeah, I can teach people to facilitate the game,
Right. Right.
but I was not involved in the.
Yeah.
I mean,
Maybe.
the fact that retrospectives show up there, I might have had some
Right.
influence over that.
Right.
But I
Right.
think it was just more my presence than anything
Right.
else.
So maybe I should have a chat with James about the game and the design of
Yes.
the game
Oh,
and separate. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're interested in game design, he'd be a
Yeah.
good person to talk
Yeah.
to.
So
Yeah.
you mentioned retrospective, and it brings
Hmm.
me to the question that I always had in my mind. Would the Agile community look at you and Esther as the retrospective queens, or or has anyone told you that kind of?
Well, there was a time, I think it was probably 2004. We first, starting in 2002, we started having gatherings of people who were interested in retrospectives and who were looking at the possibilities of them. And we began calling it the Retrospective Facilitators Gathering, and it still
Mhm.
goes on today, every year. So if anybody's interested in that, they can get in touch and I can tell them more about that. But in 2004, we were mapping kind of all the streams that retrospectives were going at that point and all the different places that was happening. And different people in the community were being given different titles. And at that session, Esther and I were given the titles of retrospective goddesses.
Okay.
I think someone else was the queen and king, and someone
Mm.
else was. I think actually it might have been Linda Rising that was the queen, and we were the goddesses or something.
Okay.
They were handing out
Yeah.
accolades pretty
Right. Right.
liberally at that point.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, we were the ones who, a number of folks had written articles about retrospectives, and even about retrospectives, using retrospectives in Agile. A lot of times they were being called heartbeat retrospectives. And at that same meeting, there were a number of folks who were saying, you know, what we really need is a book that explains retrospectives. And Esther and I just looked at each other and said, well, we could do that. We could write that. And so then over the next couple of years, we did. And the book came out in 2006.
Right.
And shortly before that, because by that time we were doing retrospective sessions at conferences and things. And by that time, Scrum had kind of, the Scrum folks had kind of broadened their thinking about the 3 meetings and decided to turn it into 4 meetings and add retrospectives to that. And it sort of became part of the Scrum canon. And then also there's always been that kind of continuous improvement in all of the Agile methods. So it just was a good fit.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's the same if you, I'm not sure if you have read a Klaus Leopold book about, not his newest one, but I don't remember the exact title. It's a yellow book. He in his book, he's talking about what is the Kanban specific, and he's talking about that retrospective should be there or should be. So it seems that continuous improvement somewhere or the other shall be there.
Right. And it really, the point is really continuous. I mean, this is one of those things like we were talking about before. There are too many people who are calling everybody together in a meeting and calling it a retrospective so that they can check off on their list that they did a retrospective, but they aren't getting the benefit from it. They aren't getting a continuous improvement. And so I mean, Leopold is right. Everyone needs some form of continuous improvement process for their organization. And then, like I said earlier, in Toyota, that's called the improvement kata. You know, and different methodologies from different. In the military, they call them lessons learned, or after action reviews. Or I mean, there are a lot of folks who understand that an experience is not worth much unless you learn something from it for when the next time you encounter a similar experience, or improve the way you encounter the similar experience. And that's what retrospectives are about. And so it's not, it has grown so that it's the way we described was a meeting, a short meeting, kind of in between a demo and the planning for the next sprint or iteration, that would happen on a sprint by sprint cadence or a release by release cadence for a longer one. But the fact that sometimes now, like some of the mob programming people are doing multiple very, very short retrospectives every day, I think that's terrific. The point is, what are you doing for continuous improvement? And that's the message that Esther and I were really trying to get across. And so, you know, in whatever form you're doing that, hooray, you know. Yeah.
I remember the name was Practical Kanban for Klaus's book.
Go good. Yeah. You always need that 17-second delay, right?
Yeah. So Diana, would you share with us any people that influence you or is an influencer in the industry that you want to share with us?
Oh my goodness. There are so many people. I mean, I take very seriously the idea that we all stand on the shoulders of giants. I mean, there are so many folks who have contributed. Ward Cunningham, Joshua Karyevsky, Ron Jeffries, Martin Fowler. They were some of the first folks that I met in the Agile space, and they encouraged me to bring what I understood and had learned. So, those are folks that I'm very, very grateful for. I'm very grateful for Linda Rising and Jutta Eckstein and many of the women that I met early on who had been involved in the object-oriented community and in the patterns community. Rebecca Werfsbrock, who also, let me know that what I might have to contribute was also useful and important to them. There's a book I read many, many years ago called Love is Letting Go of Fear by a man named Dr. Gerald Jampolsky, and that book shaped how I interact with people. Norman Kurth, who wrote the Project Retrospectives book and was a wonderful mentor and supporter, was very influential. I mean, I could just, if I go year by year by year between then and now, I mean, there are many folks that I'm leaving out that I hesitate to even start a list like that, because there are just so many folks who have influenced me over the years and who have shared their good ideas, and I just feel so fortunate to be a part of a group that is so focused on being this gift economy, where it's, the places that you get to go in the world really have a lot to do with what you're willing to contribute, and that just makes for a really rich community.
We are very fortunate to have this community.
I am. I'm blessed. Yeah.
Diana, is there anything else that we wanted to touch base on but we didn't? You want to add?
Oh gosh, I don't think so. We've been going for an hour.
Right.
And I can't, I think it's the end of the day here for me, and I know it's the end of the day for you, and I think I'm pretty much out of ideas.
Thank you so much for being on the show. I'm going to ask you to send me those resources so that we can put it on the show notes, so for the people, and maybe how to get in touch with you. And yeah, thank you so much for being on the show. It was a true pleasure to having you on board.
Well, you're welcome. It was great.